Alright, hey guys, welcome to the last lecture of AP Psychology. You have officially made it to the end. So I'm going to discuss two important concepts out of Module 80, altruism and the bystander effect. These are very important principles that you will need to know for your AP exam. So altruism, let's get into that. It is an unselfish regard for the welfare of others. Now, if you're in my sociology class, you'll be familiar with this term as we've discussed it. And it actually comes from sociology, and a lot of social psychology actually deems from the study of society or social sociology. And Auguste Comte really conned this term. And so an interesting fact about it is that it's very challenging to explain from an evolutionary psychologist stance. So in terms of evolutionary psychology, right, you're looking at survival aspects, survival of the fittest. And altruism really stumps evolutionary psychologists because it's not about your survival, you're engaged in selfless acts. And so a great example of this is Hotel Rwanda. It's a movie, but it's based on a true story about the mass genocide that occurred in Rwanda in 1994. And so Paul Rusesabagina was a hotel manager of one of the finest hotels in Rwanda. And after helping his family evacuate and the American missionaries that were staying with him at his hotel, he refused to leave Rwanda. He refused to leave the people. Even though he had the opportunity, he was very wealthy, he could have easily been evacuated. During all of this, he decided to stay, and in his selfless acts, he saved actually over 1,200 people. And to give you guys a little bit of historical context, these hostile feelings came between these two tribes, the Tutsi tribe and the Hutu tribe. And these hostile feelings really go way back to colonial times during the 1800s when the Belgians put the Tutsi tribe in power, and they were the monarch. And so by 1960, the Hutu tribe was 85% of the Rwandan population, and they eventually overthrew the Tutsi monarchy, causing a lot of these ethnic group of the Tutsi tribes to have to leave and to flee into bordering nations. And so by 1990, a lot of them had started moving back in, and there were still a lot of harsh, hostile feelings towards these two tribes. And in 1994, a plane was shot down carrying the president of Rwanda, and he was part of the Hutu tribe. And so these extremists blamed this event on the Tutsi tribe and basically wiped out 800,000 people, merciless. And they would just line them up and have these roadblocks and check your tags, your ID tags, and if you weren't a part of the Hutu tribe, they would slaughter you right there, and your family and your children. Didn't matter what your age was, as you can see in this picture. I mean, you see 20, 30 people just dead along the side of the road after being checked for ID badges. So it was brutal. And he stayed behind to help with that, and he saved many lives. So it's really an incredible story. I recommend watching the movie. Now, going back to what I was saying about altruism and how evolutionary psychologists have a challenging time explaining it, this is where many of them will go for their reasoning. And what evolutionary scientists will say is that we have this thing called our anterior cingulate gyrus, it's the CCG, the ACCG, and it's tucked away in our cerebral cortex, which is basically said to be seen as our compassionate and cooperative skill activity. This is where it's evolved in our genes. So anyways, it's just interesting to mention. Now, looking at altruism, we see that altruism is very inspiring, but the bystander effect is the opposite of inspiring. It's quite tragic. And so Kitty Genovese is a great example of the bystander effect and really where it came from. So in 1964, Kitty Genovese, a 28-year-old girl who lives in Queens, New York, 1964, she was attacked and murdered in the middle of the night at 3:20 a.m. in the morning outside her apartment building. So the actual attack lasted about 37 minutes, and she was said to have been stabbed 14 times and sexually molested. So the man who was responsible for this, his name was Winston Moseley. As you can see here, he's pictured. He was later arrested for an armed robbery, and he confessed to the murder. And the reason why his confession was so accurate is because it was a very vivid and detailed description of what had happened to Kitty Genovese, and so they correlated very well. And he was a pretty messed up dude. He actually woke up at 2 a.m. in the morning to go and find someone to murder. That was his goal for the night. I don't know, I guess he maybe wanted an adrenaline rush, and so he decided to do that by killing a woman. The really sad part about this, while it is sad that she lost her life, it took 35 minutes for anyone to actually truly intervene and call the police. 35 minutes. So the murder was 37 minutes. So the last 2 minutes of her life, of the crime, someone called in the neighborhood. I mean, she lived in a nice middle-class neighborhood, quiet neighborhood. It wasn't a loud neighborhood, so I mean, people should have heard this in the middle of the night. Now, here's the actual scene of the murder. Okay, so if you look closely, I'm going to try to show you with the mouse. You've got one here. So one, this is where Kitty parks her car, and then she is soon pursued by Moseley Winston. And then if you go down here at 2, this is actually where Moseley stabbed Kitty on the first attack. So over here, so this is where she lives, in this building, okay? Over here, however, is a big apartment building, okay? As you can see, the Mowbray Apartments, it's a 10-story apartment building. She lives over here in the Tudor building, a 2-story building. And one guy, during the first attack, when Kitty is here at number 2, and she's being attacked, one guy does yell and say, "Hey, stop, what are you doing?" out of his window. And so what he does is he actually, Moseley kind of retreats and goes back to his car, which is parked somewhere down here. And eventually Kitty gets up with the last bit of strength that she has after being stabbed several times and sexually molested. She goes to this area over here, number 3, which is near the entrance to her apartment over here at 4. So her apartment entrance is over here. And this is when still no one intervenes, and she is attacked a second time and stabbed again several more times, to a total of 14 stabbings. And then she is again sexually molested. Now, the explanation for all of this. Okay, there were reported 38 bystanders that saw the murder. 38 people were present and aware of what was happening outside in the middle of the night. And it took 35 minutes for anyone to call the police, even after she was yelling and screaming for 35 minutes. However, later reports showed that there actually weren't 38, but it was more closer to about a dozen people. Still, a dozen people. It took 35 minutes for anyone to call the police. Now, they say after being interviewed, many were unaware that it was an assault or a homicide that was in progress. Some thought maybe it was just a lover's quarrel or drunks in the middle of the night leaving a bar. But what it led to was very important, and psychologists Bibb Latané and John Darley, two guys that you need to make sure you know, Bibb Latané and John Darley, started to research what was the purpose of the bystander effect. Why did this happen? And what they found is that it was because of a diffusion of responsibility. Okay, so let's look at what is a diffusion of responsibility. Okay, so the diffusion of responsibility is a social phenomenon which tends to occur in group sizes of a certain size, in which responsibility is then not explicitly assigned. Okay, as you see down here in the bottom graph, there are 3 incidents that occur before someone actually helps. First is noticing the incident. First, we have to notice it. Second, we have to interpret it. Okay, is this an emergency? Is this person in critical condition? Or are they not? Now, the scary thing is even after interpreting it as an emergency, we then have one last step, and that is to assume responsibility. Now, unfortunately, the statistics show that the more people there are, the less possibility someone will find help, even if it is an emergency. And we see this through statistics. So here in this chart, in this graph, you see it really displays some of their findings, is that if there are 4 or more people present, only 30% of the time will someone actually help. And if there's no one involved, 85% of the time a person will take responsibility. So if no one's around and we see someone in critical condition, we generally will go over to them. Or in another study they looked at elevator rides. So they had 1,500 over the course of 1,500 elevator rides. They found that 40% of people helped if someone dropped their money and there were no bystanders present, and then only 20% helped if there were 5 or more bystanders present. So, the more bystanders, the point of that statistic is the more bystanders there are, the less likely people will be to help. Now, the biological explanation of this, looking at it from a biological standpoint in psychology, what they see and what they find is that brain activity is actually different when there are bystanders around than when there aren't bystanders around. And it's particularly in the motor cortex. So activity in the motor cortex decreases when we see more people around, and so we think, I don't need to do anything. So our brain activity even shows a difference of response. Now, it's really important to be aware of these things. These results are quite terrifying because you may find yourself in an emergency situation one day and be in this kind of situation. Or you may find someone else in an emergency. How are you going to respond in that case? So I want to show you a clip that is a bit eye-opening and very real. Would you save a stranger?
Place like this street in New York City. If you were unfortunate enough to be the victim of a crime or taken ill unexpectedly, you might think that surrounded by all these people, someone would intervene. After all, isn't there safety in numbers? Psychologists say no. Research suggests that often a victim is less likely to receive assistance when surrounded by a group rather than a single bystander. When people are in a crowd, it's easier to pass the buck. It's what psychologists call the diffusion of responsibility. Liverpool Street Station in London, a busy thoroughfare for commuters. Unknown to these passers-by, Peter is an actor. As part of an experiment on bystander apathy, he's pretending to be ill.
Help! Help!
How long before he gets help?
Please, somebody. Help! Help me, sir. Please help me.
Helping would be inconvenient or even risky. He lies there for more than 20 minutes and no one raises an eyebrow.
Please, somebody help me.
It's always very distressing to watch situations like this where people are obviously suffering and no one's actually helping them. But what we have here is two conflicting rules. One is the rule that we ought to help, and the other is the rule that we ought to do what everybody else is doing. And here you have effectively a group of strangers who are exerting the pressure not to intervene, not to help, and it's very difficult to rebel.
Ruth, another actor, takes Peter's place. How long before she receives help? Four minutes later, and 34 people have passed without stopping.
Well, people don't really want to know. They just haven't got the time. Well, they have got the time, they just don't want to get involved.
Unwittingly, these strangers have silently formed a temporary group with a rule: don't get involved. They're afraid to stand out from the crowd and won't take action if no one else does. This woman has clearly spotted Ruth, but she conforms to the rule and does nothing. Watch what happens, though, when someone else helps.
You alright? You alright?
Yes, thank you.
Sure, you look a bit flicky, you know what I mean?
She suddenly finds herself in a different group with a new rule: to help.
You want to sit up?
She don't look well, does she?
You alright, yeah? Sure.
First I thought she was dead. Then I sort of checked to see if she was breathing or not. And I looked around and I couldn't believe that no one had noticed her because there was a bloke sat there just absorbed in reading a newspaper.
This time, Peter's dressed as a respectable gentleman. Now that his dress is in keeping with those around him, how long before he's rescued?
Hello, sir. How are you today?
I'm alright.
6 seconds. She even calls him sir, and suddenly everyone's a good Samaritan.
Do you suffer from epilepsy?
No.
While you're lying on the floor in the rain?
Because he's part of the right group, everyone wants to help.
I would just hate to be in his position of feeling ill and nobody helping and walking past, so I'd just like to check that he was okay. And I thought, well, it's wet, so he must really be ill because he's going to ruin his suit anyway.
So it's really interesting. We look and we see how all of these people are just conforming to the group, whether it's ignoring the emergency, the situation at hand, or recognizing it and doing something good, doing something helpful within the emergency situation. We, as people, generally conform to the group, and so it's something to be aware of for you in the future when you're in a public place and you see something like this. You know, you may not be as quick to help as you normally think you would. So what has this all led to? Well, when we look at Kitty Genovese and her terrifying death, and we see things like this, and we look at what psychologists Biblitain and John Darley, the social psychologist who led all of these investigations to find an explanation for the bystander effect. Governments, at least in the United States, states have come up with the Good Samaritan law. And the Good Samaritan law basically states that, well, you have to protect people, and you're liable for other people's lives when they are in emergency situations, and you're expected to stay with them until help comes. So it was in these laws. They're not applied in every state. It's not a federal law. It's a state law, but it's intended to reduce the bystanders and keep them from falling trap or that hesitation of fear of being sued or prosecuted for unintentional injuries, or being seen as someone who was at fault for the individual's harm or emergency situation. So these Good Samaritan laws, while they have helped, it's still human nature to conform to the group. So I want you to look at a picture, and I want you to think about whether or not this picture I'm about to show you is unethical. Now, this picture was taken by a freelancer photographer from the New York Post, and he was present during this scene. Now, I mean, when I tell you that, and when I read that, and when I saw this, I immediately thought, what in the world was this guy thinking? Like, who would get their camera out, focus it, and take a picture of a man being killed, and then sell it to the New York Post? That's my general thought, However, there's a story behind it, okay? And a lot of times we fall into that trap of committing the fundamental attribution error, as I just gave you an example of what I had done. Because when you look at the context of it, well, this freelance photographer, the reason he had his camera, first of all, wasn't to go search for these things. He was doing another project. And he came into the station, and he was far away from this man. There's no way he could have got to the man in time to pull him out. And even if he could have, he was very weak, and so he may have been pulled in. And so what the man was actually doing was he was flashing his camera and his lens to get the train operator's attention, to get him to stop. However, of course, it didn't work. I mean, it was way too late by the time he got there. And so even if he had sprinted to this man, there's no way he would have made it. But when we see this image, what do? We generally look at the internal disposition and judge someone based on dispositional factors, and we underestimate situational factors about the person's behavior. So this is the fundamental attribution error. So we need to be careful about how we judge others, and how we judge images, and how we judge people's behavior. So this is it for today. We will have our test on Thursday and Friday. Thursday for C block, Friday for G block. And I have a fun activity for us next class. So I will see you guys later. This is our last lecture, all right? And I'm going to post some test questions or practice questions here after this slide for you to practice. All right? See you guys later.